Mapping a campaign can be very challenging. It's more than a metaphor here. I'm not talking about just doing the planning part of it. I'm talking about actually sticking it on the map so that you can understand the distances, the time involved, what it will require to move from point A to point B. When you're creating a story, do you really just figure out what it is on a timeline, or do you use a map? Hello, adventurers. Welcome back to the Red Quills. My name is Ryan, and this is the first video I'm coming back to since Mapvember. Now, if you didn't join me for that, then, well, you missed out, because I made a new video every single day. You can check out the playlist here if you really want to take a look at it. But today I'm coming back into it, and I'm going to start a new series for December and January. To finish off this year and to bring in the new one, I'm planning a little bit of a trip. I want to go from the beginning of a campaign and map out the various points that we'll be going to along the way. And you can use these points independently, you can get some ideas from them, but I also want to bring in the new year and celebrate that Yuletide spirit by creating a campaign that explores some of the themes of midwinter. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to start by planning it out. I'm going to talk about where we're going to go along the journey. I'm going to talk about what I keep in mind when I create and map a campaign. And I'm going to talk about the techniques and the tools that I use along the way. So this is my first video following November. I am a little bit tired and weary, but I'm using this opportunity while I'm cutting down on the number of videos, because I'm only coming out with one a week while we do this, to really overhaul a lot of my systems. If you want to check the stuff out that I am doing, go and check out the new website that I've made. The link is in the description below. I'm doing new ways of commissions. I've got downloadables on there, as well as printed versions of the maps that I've done. If you have things that you want me to do on the website, if you think that there are things that people might want to see me upgrade my platforms to have on them, this is your chance to really let me know what ideas you have while I'm upgrading everything and looking into how I can make things a little bit better and just make the Red Quills everything that it should be as we're going on here. So grab out your paper, get your pens out, and we will start with a blank sheet of A3 paper. Now, a lot of the things that I'm going to be doing today aren't necessarily going to be mapping. The map is the pinnacle of this pyramid of work that we're doing. It's an expression of what we got to do. And in order to explain what I'm doing on the map, we really need to go over a lot of theory. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to talk about what I keep in mind when I map something out like this. And then I'm going to make the timeline. And then we're going to sit down and do the map. So first thing that we want to do is we want to talk about the parts of an adventure. Now, this is pretty simple. We've talked about it beforehand. If you've watched my Mega Dungeons videos, you will know that when I create a dungeon, I tend to divide it into a different kind of challenge, whether that challenge is, a puzzle or a trap or a choice or a climax or a combat. Generally speaking, each of the chambers falls into one of those 5 categories, but I also tend to differentiate them individually. For instance, a gauntlet trap is very different to a mechanical trap. It tells you a little bit more about the dungeon and its inhabitants and the people who set it up, and what kind of skill checks that you will be putting your players through if you're playing a TTRPG. So in this case, what I want to do is I want to create a little bit of a pie chart, a little bit of a diagram to remind us of exactly what we want to see in a campaign. What are the big challenges that players want to enjoy in a TTRPG? Now, in general, the big 3 are on the right-hand side of this little diagram. They are combat challenges, puzzle-solving challenges, and role-playing challenges. And most players of TTRPGs, want at least one of those things. If you're a min-maxer, you want to enjoy the combat and the skill checks. If you're a role player, you want to be talking to shopkeepers and negotiating political contracts. If you like winning a game, then you like puzzle-solving. You like riddles and figuring out the big mysteries of the world. And so what we're going to do is we're going to flesh those out a little bit more as well, with different subtitles underneath each of those headings. Under combat, we've got ambushes, arena fights, tests, and skill combats. Under puzzle solvings, you have mechanical traps, logic puzzles, resource scarcity, and time management. Under role playing, you have things like creating alliances or making nemeses, finding out about the lore and the backstory, making choices, haggling with shopkeeper, having moral dilemmas. And between the 3 categories there and all the various subcategories, you've got all the ingredients you need to make a good game, but that's not all we want to do. Those are just the role-playing, the playing parts of the world. What we want is to flesh the world out a little bit more. So let's take a look at the other parts of this diagram. Let's think of any adventure as a line. The red points on this diagram, combat, puzzle solving, and role-playing, are the points on that line. They are the things that you move between. They're the big moments, the events that people will remember. What we're going to do is we're going to add in the blue. And the blue is the process of how you get from one point to another. If the red is the noun, the blue is the verb. And so let's talk about the 4 different categories of moving through an adventure, whether those are consequences, twists, choices, or divergences. And what we're talking about here is how the player's actions directly impact on the story. The story is the red points. The blue points is how they've made a difference, because the point in playing a TTRPG is that they do make a difference to the world. It doesn't necessarily need to be the difference they intended to make. It doesn't need to be good or bad. But the reason that they play is because they want to feel like their actions have significance, that they have an outcome in their participation in this world. And the reason that I've divided them into these 4 categories is because these are the 4 different kinds of outcomes you can have from participation in an event. A consequence is the simplest. It's moving from one point to another. It's a direct after effect of your actions. And consequences can be things like old enemies returning. They can be power imbalances if you've killed off the big bad and have a conflict between some new forces who want to take their place. It can be loss of wealth or friends or meaning. It can be the removal of choice, or it can be favors called in, old enemies re-emerging, reminding them that their actions have had an impact on the world, and bringing them back to the present is what consequences is. It's a straight line, really, connecting the past to the present. The next one are the twists. And these are consequences, but unexpected. And this is where you find out that people have lied to you, whether you're being betrayed by people, whether you have incomplete information or being manipulated, whether you have prophecies in your world that need to be fulfilled, because a prophecy is supposed to be a twist. You should never be able to really predict everything that should come to pass in a prophecy. And by twisting the consequences that you are expecting, you make a world that is more explorable, that is less predictable, that is more exciting for your players. Then we can move on to the choices. Now, if a consequence is simple, let's say a player heads into the main capital and they find that a vampire is on the throne, drinking the blood of, all the young nobles. And they decide that that's, a bad thing to do, and they remove this vampire from being the head of this political cartel. They come back in 6 months' time, and there's a consequence for that outcome. It is that, there's now a power vacuum. That vampire was, removed, and suddenly there is a throne that needs a ruler, and a civil war has taken place. That's a direct consequence. You can predict that, knowing that the vampire is a bad guy and it needs to be removed. But if you give the players a little bit more of a nuanced outcome, for instance, if they come to speak to the vampire and the vampire tells them that everyone's made an agreement to keep this status quo, that drinking the blood of the nobles, keeps the vampire in power and sated, and that a vampire's superior intellect and long-lived life means that their legal system is ironclad, that there's always a precedent for something, and that the ruler has a very balanced temperament when it comes to considering the long-term consequences of their actions. The players now have a choice. They can leave the vampire on the throne, aware that everyone is, taking into consideration what is going on, or they can remove the vampire, assuming that, a blood-sucking monster is always a blood-sucking monster. That is an active choice, but either choice will have a consequence in the future. So a choice here is where their actions will directly impact on the present, but in one of 2 very different ways, and you can show them how those outcomes are very different. And we're going to be talking here about things like nature versus nurture, good versus justice, law versus freedom. It's always got to be a conflict between 2 opposing concepts. If you're talking about good versus evil, that's a great basis for a campaign. But the more nuance you have, the more difference you make between one point and another that isn't just good and evil. Which is better, between being free to pursue what you want to pursue, or being kept safe and orderly by a society that puts everyone in a nice category and makes sure that there's room for all, order versus freedom, or justice versus righteousness, those kinds of nuances, and bringing them back to the present and showing them how the consequences of their actions can change according to what they prioritize the most is the third category. The fourth category is the divergences. And we built on consequences with choice, and divergences is the other one. That's where you expect a consequence, but it doesn't come. We're talking about lawlessness. We're talking about changings of the patterns. We're talking about alterations of destiny or refusing the call if a prophecy is involved. A divergence is unexpected, like a twist is, but it's how the players have altered the course of events. Consequences were always going to happen. Choices are showing you the difference between one outcome and another. A divergence is where something should have happened but didn't. And then finally we get to the last part of this particular pie chart, and that is where we really start making the map, because this part of the pie chart is the exploration of the world. That's what we're here for. That's what we love mapping for, because we create these whole worlds and the players are there to explore it. Under exploration, you'll find things like maps, documents, open worlds, consequential events, and character growth and surprises. This part of the adventure is self-driven. And so the purpose of the rest of the pie chart is to make the world interesting enough that they want to explore it. That's what we want to aim here for. Every part of this diagram relies on the other parts of the diagram to flesh out the adventure. We've got the points, we've got the arrows between them, and now we've got the justification, the drive to move from one point to another. And so understanding that that's the distribution of different kinds of challenge, different kinds of consequence within the world, now we can move on to the next step. We can understand what kind of enemies we want to be looking at. That's the story. We're talking now about the antagonists. Now, what I'm going to do for this one is I'm going to create a very simple graph. Nice, plain. On the one axis, we'll create intelligence, and on the other axis, we'll create power. Now, going up gradually in both will give us a standard power crawl. As you go from low levels to high levels, from low power to high power, you'll start with enemies that are very low in their own power and very low in their intelligence, the grunts of the world. And finally, you'll end up with a villain that is powerful and intelligent. That's the danger zone right there. The more powerful and the more intelligent you are, the bigger the problem you're going to be in the long term. But there's different areas as well, and we want to vary them around. If you have, for instance, a fairly high power monster with low intelligence, you've got a monster of the week. That's not something that's going to be pursuing the players. It's not something that they really need to strategize too hard around. They've got to go in, they've got to defeat it, and they'll feel good about themselves. On the other side of that, you've got low power creatures that have a lot of intelligence. These are the schemers of the world. These are the evil viziers and the plotters in the background. These are the doppelgangers who manipulate events. They will return, and they have to return over and over again because they can't actually do much damage to the players unless they do. And we've got different layers as well. At the top, if they're moderate in power and higher intelligence, you've got puppet masters. If we've got low power and low intelligence, we've got thugs. We've got recurring henchfolk if they're moderately powerful and low intelligence. We've got a petty zone for villains that are moderate intelligence but low power. Recurring villains are, and I want to differentiate as well, recurring villains from main antagonists. Main antagonists are top right of this little graph. But recurring villains tend to be villains who don't necessarily manipulate everything. You don't want them to be too clever because you want the players to kind of hate them rather than fearing them. You want a little bit of contempt there. And in order to get that, you need someone who's not really as clever as they think they are, but clever enough to escape every time. If you really want to foster that hatred, that's where you want your recurring villains to be. And the other one that I want to add in here is a category called Beat the Second Time. A monster of the week is a monster that's powerful but unintelligent. But if a creature is powerful and has moderate intelligence, then it'll probably be able to defeat them the first time using tactics, strategy, knowledge of its environment. And the players will be forced to retreat. They will be forced to try to outthink it. They can't just, raw power their way through the first one. So that's the zone where a creature is powerful enough to drive them off the first time and force them to rethink their strategy and come back the second time. And then that means that we finish up with a diagram that looks a little bit like this. And the reason that I've done this is so that we know what kind of enemy we're going to be looking at to fill out the various points on this timeline. So now we're figuring out what kinds of enemies flesh out those points. We're creating a timeline here, and I'm going to use the symbols that we fleshed out in the original pie chart. And now an understanding of what kind of enemies we want to see to figure out the real shape of this adventure. And that's the reason that I sat down and really explained what we're talking about in terms of how to create this adventure, because I'm going to be referring to these symbols, these different kinds of encounters, in order to flesh out this sort of timeline, this two-dimensional map that leads from the beginning to the end. And for those of you who are worried about me railroading, don't worry. We'll get to that in a little bit. By the way, if you're enjoying this video, like and subscribe. Comment below if you want to help the algorithm, and hit that hype button below as well. We're trying to get this channel a little bit bigger, help more people out with their TTRPGs. So there's only one thing else that I want to do before we get onto the mapping itself, and that is talk about the different kinds of non-combat events that we can encounter in a world. So we talked about the challenges, we talked about the consequences, the points and the arrows on this timeline. We talked about fleshing them out with a little bit of detail about the antagonists. Let's talk about fleshing it out in terms of what is not an antagonist. And that's really simple. A short list of things that they can encounter that will be one of those different kinds of challenge within the game, but won't be a battle. So we're talking about neutral NPCs, hostile or friendly NPCs. We're talking about the chase mechanics. We're talking about environmental difficulties, rest versus interrupted rests, resupplying, lore dumps, or lasting injuries. What we want here is the exploration of the option for consequences beyond the initial event. I'm not going too much into detail about things like traps or puzzles in this part of it as well, because those tend to be what we flesh out when we create the maps of various locations. And we'll get to that as we go through the journey after this video. These are just the kind of broad sweeping strokes of more points that we can add that aren't combat. Now today, as we do talk about this, I do want to point out that what we're doing here is we're creating a storyline, which isn't necessarily the same thing as a map. In the past, in recent videos, I've talked about how maps are a three-dimensional exploration of the space. They're an open world, a sandbox for the players to explore, but a quest, a journey, is two-dimensional. It doesn't need a full box, it just needs a line from one point to another. What we're doing today is working on the line so that we know what the story arcs are going to be. But what we are creating, the final outcome, is going to be a box. The reason that I'm focusing on the quest is so that we know and understand what to expect when creating such an arc and how we can scatter these points around on a three-dimensional space. But what I want you to keep in mind is that we will finish up with a sandbox that they can go to and activate different parts of the quest at the same time. It's just that the outcomes, the consequences of those events will become more and more contingent to the story the further and further into the quest they go. The order that they do them isn't necessarily important. The story will progress as a result of their consequences, their choices, their processes as they go through. So that's worth keeping in mind. And for creating something like this, I would absolutely recommend a resource like WorldANVIL. Now, I've talked in the past about the resources that you can use when you're creating some of your campaigns. And in this case, I would recommend something like WorldANVIL because it allows you as a platform for your world building, for your lore building, for your maps, as well as a digital resource. You can upload everything early on. You can have it as distinct articles and scatter it around the map so that you don't need to rely on a single line like we're creating here. The line is your basis to create the story. Uploading it as independent articles and sticking it on a page will allow you as a DM to react in the moment to the decisions that your players make. Thank you to WorldANVIL for sponsoring this video, by the way. I'm very happy to be collaborating with them on this, and I do like their platform for what it can give you for your storytelling. So if you want to check it out, there is a link in the description below. There is a 51% off on the link that you can check out if you want to get it for yourself. Otherwise, stick some questions in the comments if you want to talk with me more about it. And so now we have an understanding of what this two-dimensional line is. This is the series of events that we kind of want to flesh out, one after another after another. And this is where I want to talk about railroading, because we don't want to remove the player's agency. We want them to be able to choose where to go and when to go there. But also, it is always good and fun and interesting to make sure that they know that their actions have a consequence, that they can absolutely choose not to go somewhere. But if they do, the consequences may be dire. So I'm going to take this timeline that I've created, an idea of who they're going to be facing and when, and what the arrows that connect these points are, and I'm going to make a map. We're going to design the hunt of the Winter King. And what I'm talking about here is an overriding quest, an idea, a concept that will drive them from one point on this line to the other point on this line. Generally speaking, there's a lot of different ways to do this, but the best way is by a primary antagonist or a recurring villain. One of the ones that we talked about before, either at the top right of that little diagram or somewhere in, the top center. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create an antagonist that does make sure that they move from one point to another, but not necessarily with them being aware of it. We want them to start with an adventure that seems to be, on the surface, fairly typical. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make it a fairly low-level creature, an owl bear, which they've been contracted to go into the woods and find and kill, because it's appeared recently in an abandoned fort and the locals want it taken care of. That's the beginning of this particular quest, and it is their opportunity to turn away if necessary, because the owlbear has been marked as prey by the primary antagonist. Their killing it before he gets to it is the beginning of the quest, the start of that rolling boulder of consequences, that avalanche that moves down the mountain. The quest has them take the trophy to the nearby village. It's a requirement. Again, they can choose not to do that. Any choice that they make up until this point can remove the rest of the quest entirely. But again, we want them to choose what we want them to choose. If they choose to turn away, that's fine. We can find another way to bring them into the quest. But if they take the owlbear's head where they are asked to for the contract, the village of Fran, they will find out that there's another creature nearby. And they can, again, choose to pursue that mystery or head off. If they choose to pursue it, then they'll go and find the griffin, and they will slay the griffin. And again, find that it is marked once more. And immediately following that encounter, they will be confronted by the hostile NPC. In this particular case, the riders of the Wild Hunt. Now we introduce the primary antagonist. They've had one encounter early on in which they didn't know what they were doing. The second encounter is the coincidence, the point that connects those two dots. And now meeting these antagonists, the riders of the hunt, gives them a focal point for their fear, the Winter King. How we get from point 2 to point 3 is entirely up to the players. Again, what we want to do here is not railroad them into methods, but we do want them to reach the next point along the quest. How they decide to get there is entirely up to them. But what you've got to kind of think of when you're creating quests like this is that railroading is you choosing every part of the adventure for them, forcing them to do certain things. You don't get to choose the methods. But the reason that we can make sure that this quest takes place is because the primary antagonist wants it to take place. You aren't being a god puppeting their every move. You can give them agency. But whatever action they take, whatever strategy or tactic they put into place, their antagonist will be aware of and will alter his plans accordingly. It's not railroading. It's just the bad guy. So the king of the Wild Hunt, the Winter King, Oberon, will know that they have been taking his prey, and he will take it as a direct challenge. Either his riders will chase them through the woods, or he will invite them himself, or they'll stumble across it as they're trying to get back to safety, but a lodge will appear in the center of the Winter King's hunting grounds, and they will head inside and meet the king himself. What I'm going with here is the Green Lord, Oberon. He's one of the arch-fae of the Feywilds in D&D lore. He exists across several references to fairies and the fae in our own mythology. And I have always depicted him in my versions of the campaigns as being a primal representation of a sort of bestial abandon. His domain is the domain of the hunt, of rage and bloodlust. And he is everything that his wife Titania is not. During the winter, he leaves the Feywilds and heads into the mortal world and marks prey with his mark and gives himself the challenge of hunting it before midnight on Midwinter's Eve. If he can find all of the prey and capture it before then, killing it if necessary, then he's won his particular game for the year and he returns happily to the court back in the Feywild. If he does not, his wrath is great. And so now the players are confronted with a choice. They can participate willingly in the king's challenge and win a prize if they succeed, or they can refuse his invitation, which risks angering the king, who will probably hunt them anyway. And now we've set up the rest of the encounters along the way. And I do have an order for them, but that's less significant. All we're going to do now is we're going to give them a prerequisite, which is to say that the king wants to hunt them down by midnight on Midwinter's Eve. If they can avoid detection until then, hunky-dory. If they cannot, then the king will find them and battle them. Now we move again away from railroading, because we've got a set of locations that they can run to if they're running. They will come across accidentally. They can choose to avoid if necessary. And these are all just things that we're fleshing out. All you can do as a storyteller is show them the signposts along the road. Whether they choose to turn off is entirely up to them. If they choose to find safety amongst the local villages, then they will find that ordinary folk are very unwilling to risk the wrath of Oberon, who comes here annually to hunt. They will be betrayed by the NPCs, or the riders of the Wild Hunt will find them. He is a hunter of exceptional caliber and quality, and he will be able to find them. So we want to keep them on their toes, we want to chase them, and we want to flesh out the rest of these points. More beasts, possible allies, and betrayals as we go through. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about that journey as we get to it. But in the meantime, I'm going to finish off this map, and you can see that I've used the various icons that I talked about on my original page to figure out what the different acts are in this story. The map itself is the hunting ground of Oberon. If they accept his challenge, he will tell them not to leave the area. If they do not accept his challenge, then they will be aware that this is his hunting ground and everyone within it will be assisting him, as they always do every year when he comes to hunt. So they will attempt to leave it with all haste. But that's really kind of where the quest is encapsulated. If they try to leave, we can have other events happen to try to keep them into place. If they try to make friends, they will be betrayed. But this map gives us a fair understanding of where the obstacles will be, and a fair concept of the different areas of where the encounters will take place and who will betray them where. That's what we kind of want to go for. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my coat, and we're going to start out, and I'm going to go to each of these locations. We'll have a little bit more of a talk about the various layers that we can start with. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the owl bear. Now we're fleshing out what the Whoops. What are you doing? All right.